The Castle Hill Rebellion, also known as the Battle of Vinegar Hill, was a significant convict uprising that took place on March 4th to 5th, 1804, in the British colony of New South Wales, Australia. Led predominantly by Irish convicts, many of whom were veterans of the 1798 Irish Rebellion. This event marked the first major insurrection against colonial authority in Australia. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution. With a PhD in history and a love for storytelling, I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below. By the early 19th century, the British colony of New South Wales was home to a growing population of convicts, many of them Irish. Among them were men who had fought in the 1798 Irish Rebellion, a brutal conflict in which Irish revolutionaries sought to overthrow British rule. For their role in the uprising, these rebels were not just sentenced to transportation. They were deliberately exiled to the farthest reaches of the empire, where their hopes for freedom would be buried under the weight of penal servitude. But exile did not extinguish their defiance. Conditions in the colony were harsh. The penal settlements were built on discipline and control, with forced labor at the core of daily life. Many of the Irish convicts were assigned to the government farms at Castle Hill, an isolated outpost west of Sydney. Officially, these farms were meant to provide food for the colony, but for the prisoners, they were a place of relentless toil, where backbreaking work and the lash of the overseer reinforced their status as subjects of an oppressive system. Beneath the surface, however, a network of resistance was forming. The Irish convicts at Castle Hill had not forgotten their homeland. Among them were former soldiers, insurgents, and political prisoners who had fought under the banner of the United Irishmen, men who had once risen against British rule with the rallying cry of liberty or death. They had witnessed rebellion before, and many had the scars to prove it. News of further uprisings in Ireland, particularly Robert Emmet's failed 1803 rebellion, reached their ears, reigniting old aspirations. For them, Australia was not just a prison, it was another battleground. In whispered conversations and secret gatherings, plans were drawn. A revolt was no longer just an idea, it was a necessity. The objective was clear: take up arms, seize control of the colony, and secure passage back to Ireland. The plan relied on swift action and overwhelming force. The convicts believed they could rally thousands to their cause, overwhelming the colonial authorities before they had time to react. With the right timing, with enough men, with enough weapons, perhaps, this time, they could succeed. March 4th, 1804, was set as the night of the uprising. The signal would be unmistakable: a fire set ablaze at the Castle Hill farm. Once the flames were seen, convicts across the region would rise, breaking free from their chains and marching on Sydney. Their goal was not just escape, it was insurrection. The colony, and perhaps their future, hung in the balance. As dusk fell on March 4th, 1804, a fire erupted at the Castle Hill government farm, the signal for the uprising to begin. The convicts moved swiftly, breaking into government stores and arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Muskets, pistols, and makeshift pikes were gathered, and those who had no arms carried farming tools, ready to fight. Philip Cunningham, an experienced Irish rebel, took command, directing the men toward their objective, Parramatta, the administrative center of the colony. If they could take it, they could secure more weapons, ammunition, and ultimately, control of Sydney. But the rebellion did not unfold as planned. While 233 convicts rose at Castle Hill, they had expected hundreds more to join from surrounding farms and settlements. Some groups lost their way in the darkness, failing to regroup at the designated points. Others hesitated, uncertain of the rebellion's success. Still, Cunningham and his men pressed forward, moving under the cover of night toward Vinegar Hill, a high vantage point where they hoped to rally their forces. The name was no coincidence. Many of these men had fought in the original Battle of Vinegar Hill in Ireland, and now they sought to avenge that defeat on colonial soil. At Parramatta, Governor Philip Gidley King received word of the insurrection. Alarm spread quickly through the colony. Martial law was declared, and King ordered immediate action to crush the uprising before it could gain momentum. The New South Wales Corps, under the command of Major George Johnston, mobilized a force of 97 soldiers and militia, armed with muskets, bayonets, and artillery. They moved quickly, determined to intercept the rebels before they reached Sydney. As dawn broke on March 5th, the rebels reached Rouse Hill, where they halted to reorganize. Their numbers had swelled, but they remained disorganized. Lacking cavalry or trained officers, they struggled to maintain formation. Their weapons were limited, and they were running out of time. The colonial forces were closing in. Major Johnston arrived with his troops, assessing the situation before engaging. Rather than immediately attacking, he attempted to negotiate, sending Father James Dixon, a Catholic priest, to parley with the rebels. Johnston's offer was clear: surrender now, and their lives would be spared. But Cunningham and his men had come too far to lay down their arms. They rejected the terms, demanding freedom or death. Johnston, sensing an opportunity, used deception. Under the pretense of further negotiations, he and his men moved in closer, seizing Cunningham and several other leaders. The moment their commanders were captured, confusion spread through the rebel ranks. The militia opened fire, cutting down those who attempted to resist. The rebels, realizing the battle was lost, scattered into the bush. Some fought on, others tried to escape, but within hours, the uprising was over. The largest convict rebellion in Australian history had been crushed before it could reach its final objective. The rebellion at Castle Hill was the greatest threat the colony of New South Wales had faced. News of the uprising spread rapidly, and before the convicts could reach Parramatta, Governor Philip Gidley King acted decisively. With the colony's survival at stake, he declared martial law, giving the military unrestricted authority to suppress the insurrection. This was the first time martial law had been imposed in Australia, and it signaled the severity of the crisis. King's orders were clear: the rebels were to be captured or killed. The New South Wales Corps, the main military force in the colony, was mobilized under Major George Johnston, a veteran officer with experience in colonial security. Johnston assembled a force of 97 soldiers and armed settlers, a disciplined unit equipped with muskets, bayonets, and a small field artillery piece. Their objective was straightforward: intercept the rebels before they could reach Sydney and prevent the insurrection from spreading. Johnston moved swiftly, leading his forces toward the convicts' position at Vinegar Hill. Along the way, they gathered intelligence from local settlers, who had either fled their homes or had been coerced into aiding the rebels. The military's advantage was not just in firepower, but in logistics. Unlike the convicts, who relied on secrecy and speed, the colonial forces had the infrastructure to coordinate movements and track the insurgents' advance. By the early hours of March 5, 1804, the soldiers reached Rouse Hill, where the rebels had paused to regroup. Rather than launching an immediate attack, Johnston attempted to break the uprising through negotiation. He sent Father James Dixon, a Catholic priest, to speak with the rebel leaders, hoping that the presence of a clergyman would persuade them to surrender. Dixon urged Cunningham and his men to lay down their arms, promising fair treatment if they complied. But the rebels, driven by their desire for freedom, refused to submit. With diplomacy exhausted, Johnston resorted to deception. Under the guise of further negotiations, he maneuvered his forces closer to the rebel leaders. In a sudden and calculated move, his men seized Philip Cunningham and other key figures. With their command structure broken, the rebels faltered. Johnston's troops then opened fire, unleashing musket volleys into the scattered ranks of the insurgents. Within minutes, the battle was over. Some rebels fought to the end, others fled into the bush, but without leadership or strategy, resistance collapsed. The colonial authorities had crushed the uprising before it could threaten the core of the settlement. In its wake, martial law remained in effect for several days, ensuring that any lingering pockets of resistance were swiftly dealt with. The colony, though shaken, remained firmly under British control. At dawn on March 5, 1804, the rebel force, numbering over 200, had gathered on high ground near Rouse Hill, a location they would refer to as Vinegar Hill, invoking the memory of the failed 1798 Irish Rebellion. For many of them, this was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a continuation of an unfinished revolt. Armed with muskets, pistols, and crude farm tools, they waited for reinforcements that would never arrive. Across the clearing, Major George Johnston and his detachment of New South Wales Corps soldiers and militia prepared to confront the insurgents. Though outnumbered in theory, the government force had the advantage of organization, training, and superior weaponry. Johnston's goal was to end the rebellion with minimal bloodshed, but he was also prepared to use lethal force to do so. Before engaging, Johnston sent Father James Dixon to negotiate, hoping to persuade the rebels to surrender. Dixon, an Irish Catholic priest who held the rare position of spiritual leader among the convicts, pleaded with them to abandon the fight. His appeals were rejected. The rebels, led by Philip Cunningham and William Johnston, demanded unconditional liberty and declared they would not be taken alive. Johnston then employed a tactical ruse. Under the appearance of continued negotiation, he and a small party approached the rebels and suddenly seized Cunningham, taking the rebel commander prisoner. This move threw the insurgents into confusion. Their leadership had been removed in an instant. Without coordination, the rebel force hesitated, unsure whether to charge, retreat, or negotiate. Sensing the moment, Johnston ordered his men to fire. A short but intense skirmish followed. Musket volleys tore through the rebel ranks, and within minutes, at least 15 convicts lay dead, with more wounded or captured. The rest broke and fled into the surrounding bushland, pursued by mounted troops and local settlers acting as militia. No reinforcements ever came. The uprising was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The battlefield at Vinegar Hill was silent by mid-morning. Scattered weapons, discarded coats, and the bodies of fallen convicts marked the final stand. For those who had believed they were striking a blow for Irish independence, even from the edge of the empire, the confrontation ended not in glory, but in arrest, reprisal, and execution. In the days that followed the confrontation at Vinegar Hill, the colonial authorities acted swiftly to extinguish any remnants of the rebellion. Martial law, declared by Governor King, remained in effect across the Parramatta and Hawkesbury districts for 1 week, giving military and civil officers broad powers to search, detain, and punish without the constraints of regular judicial procedure. Patrols combed the countryside, arresting suspected participants and rounding up escapees who had fled into the bush after the failed uprising. The response was as symbolic as it was punitive. The government needed to demonstrate that insurrection would not be tolerated, not by convicts, and certainly not by those with a history of rebellion in Ireland. Philip Cunningham, the rebellion's leader, was executed without formal trial on March 6, a day after his capture. His death was carried out in Parramatta, in public, before a crowd of convicts and settlers. Reports described the execution as rushed and irregular, but entirely intentional. It was meant to send a message. Others were soon to follow. 9 men were executed, some publicly, others on the farms where they had been assigned, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Dozens more were sentenced to floggings of up to 500 lashes, while several were transported to the secondary penal settlement of Newcastle, then regarded as a place of harsh punishment and isolation. The measures were meant not only to discipline, but to fracture any sense of solidarity that might have lingered among the Irish convicts. Despite the scale of the punishment, authorities also recognized that many had been coerced into participation. Several individuals were spared on the grounds of limited involvement or because they had attempted to withdraw once the rebellion faltered. But the colonial government made no effort to address the underlying grievances. Conditions at Castle Hill remained severe, and the penal system unrelenting. The Catholic priest James Dixon, who had been used by Major Johnston during the confrontation, found himself under suspicion. Though he had worked to convince the rebels to surrender, his presence at the scene raised doubts about his loyalty. Within months, the government revoked his license to conduct Mass, effectively silencing the only authorized Catholic voice in the colony. The site of the battle itself was left unmarked, and for many years, the event faded from official narratives. Yet among the Irish convict population, it became a whispered legacy, a reminder that even in chains, resistance was possible, and that their struggle against imperial domination had not ended with their exile to the far side of the world. For much of Australia's colonial period, the Castle Hill Rebellion was either omitted from public memory or minimized in official histories. The colonial administration treated it as an episode of criminal unrest rather than a political uprising. But beneath the surface of imperial narratives, the Battle of Vinegar Hill retained meaning, especially among Irish Australians who saw in it a continuation of the long resistance to British domination, a rebellion not merely of convicts, but of political exiles. In time, the uprising came to be understood not only as a desperate act of defiance, but as Australia's first organized rebellion. It marked the moment when convict resistance coalesced into coordinated action, driven by ideology as well as survival. The event shattered the illusion of passive submission among transported prisoners and forced the colonial authorities to rethink the management of Irish political convicts. The penal system responded with increased surveillance, more isolated settlements, and a reduction in the freedoms previously afforded to some prisoners. For Irish Catholics in the colony, the memory of 1804 was complicated. The rebellion had failed, and its leaders were executed, but their cause endured. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Irish nationalism grew stronger in Australia, the Castle Hill Rebellion was reclaimed as part of that lineage, a colonial episode tied to a global movement against British rule. The naming of the 1804 conflict as the Battle of Vinegar Hill, directly referencing the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, reinforced its symbolic status as part of a transnational Irish struggle. Commemoration remained largely informal until the 20th century. It wasn't until 1985, on the 181st anniversary of the uprising, that a formal monument was erected near Rouse Hill, acknowledging the rebellion's significance. The event has since become a site of reflection for both Irish Australians and broader communities interested in the legacies of resistance, colonialism, and penal transportation. In recent decades, historians have re-examined the rebellion with greater nuance, moving beyond simplistic readings of convict mutiny to consider its political, cultural, and ideological dimensions. It is now recognized as a foundational moment in the development of Australia's radical tradition, a moment when the boundaries between convict, rebel, and citizen began to blur, foreshadowing future calls for rights, representation, and reform within a penal colony that would one day become a nation. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.